Okay, first of all, I'm at work, so I gotta kind of like when I've been working for the day, I kind of gotta
Oh,
like.
me too. Yeah, I just yeah, just came out of spreadsheets, so it's not
Oh, geez.
the most fluid place to think. It's all lines and stuff, right? So
Yeah, yeah. No, that's good. I mean, I don't know, man. I find that work is such an interesting challenge because on one hand, it's nice to have the routine of it and to find place to be and things to do and whatnot. But I also really struggle with and I love my job. I have a great job. My job's fantastic. I couldn't really ask for anything else. But like, I really struggle with the kind of dreading going to work and then like trying to finish and go home.
yeah,
And then I'm often like pulling or pushing, and it gets difficult to maintain that flow.
yeah, especially when you get like peak experiences and then you're just so not on the peak. So it's so apparent that you're not on the peak that it's a different like a meta grind kind of thing where you just get in your head basically. I do it too all the time.
Yeah, yeah. Like I don't know, my focus for probably 4 or 5 months now and ongoing is really about, okay, I feel like I've a lot of this stuff way up here is kind of settled out for me, and I love going up there and looking at things.
Mm.
Really want to get to bring it down because I don't want to be. I'm so sick of struggling with myself. I don't want to struggle with myself, and
Yes.
so like I feel like the last several months has just been really like, how do I turn my attention onto that, find peace, really?
Yeah, that's actually part of why I wanted to talk to you about the conversation we had with John, because I think the way we both went about talking with him was quite different in a very interesting way. And I was thinking about it a little bit because me much more so than normal in that conversation. We talked about the problem of flowing with the flow guy, the meta problem of flowing with the flow guy. That was, I was super nervous. So essentially, I was not embodying my right hemisphere through that conversation. I was exclusively, I was using it, integrating it with the flow, but I wasn't presencing it. So it wasn't reciprocally forming the way that you would hope to. And I think it's important to, if we are claiming to know or to be poking around this territory, to when we're not in right relationship, be able to bring that forward as an example of that. But actually, I think it's super useful in this case to look back at that conversation and look at the different things that we're doing with John, um, because I think you were trying to essentially do the same thing as me from the opposite way, and we're
Mhm.
often like that. It's part of why we get along, right? Um, and in a sense, I think I've been thinking about how to express this, and I think in a sense, what I was trying to do was go around, and you were trying to go within.
Mm.
And so those are different ways of being the through line. Sorry. If you go with the left hemisphere, I think it's good at going around because you can identify the poles so well. You're just like, okay, these are the polarities that are involved, and then we could just recur around those polarities, and we're capturing everything within. And that I think that's what sort of synchronizing your left hemisphere and your brainstem affords you this great mental clarity of how all the concepts fit together. Um, and I think that's the map. Really, that's the divine map in a sense. If you have everything lined up there, but what that is not going through and within,
Mm.
which you have the right hemisphere, the embodiment is, in a sense, if we're talking about sort of the constructing your halo, if we drop all the subtleness of it, like that's what we're talking about, basically the time space that is a undisturbed pond that perfectly aligns to the ripples of the divine pond. And I think that was the cool thing, hearing John resonate with that concept, basically that like that is kind of what he's talking about. But yeah, so basically, I think what I was talking about ultimately was really flow, and you were
Hmm.
talking about churn, which is a concept that I was thinking about in terms of when you try and go into the flow and you have to deal with all the parts of you that aren't aligned to your map. So as you embody the territory, that's where all the bumps are. That's where all the
Hmm.
flipping has to happen to you, because you
Yeah.
as a you know, you're going through a map that coheres, but a lot of those coherences are from inversions. And so
Mm.
your actual perspective has to do the flip manually itself as you're going through that. And that's why it's such a, that's kind of the flames of the unconscious in a sense, right? Is the fact that you're going to have to go through all these loops and disintegrate as that process of going through it.
Mm. Yeah. So is it something like the trying to embody and make the conceptual mapping existential in your real life versus just
Yes.
working around the mapping?
Yes.
Like in the aroundness, you're you're trying to flow with the mapping and allow be what may in the existential space. Whereas in the churning, as you're using it, it's more of like it's the actual, like, really, if like kind of from what we were talking about in that conversation, then this is where the ritual really comes in. It's how do I flip that perspective? How do I flip that stance and posture when I'm no longer in the flow? Something like that.
Yes. Yeah. So in a sense, if ritual is tying everything together, then ritual is showing you how the map is the territory and the territory is the map. And that's only possible through right relation. You can't get to that synchronized resonance unless you're properly doing both aspects of that. Um,
Mhm.
and so much of what you were talking about was really about the personal nature of going through the process. When we watched the talk, I realized that's what you were trying to do. I was stuck on the conceptual, like, oh, when you see it later, it's integrated. Things can be simple and not easy. Those are completely different. How easy or hard something is has nothing to do with how simple and complex it is. And if you can make
Yeah,
something
yeah,
as hard as it is, if you make it incredibly simple, it's very useful because it clarifies the map and your orientation. But it's not the same thing as doing it. And so
yeah,
actually doing it, that I know that's where you're trying to get to and dive in. So um, I just wanted to emphasize like how separate those two things are, and
mm,
how the left hemisphere is good at the map. That's what it's good at. And the right hemisphere is good at the embodiment, the exemplifying of
mm,
uh, of the principles. So if the polarities are the principles, then them enacted through every moment of being and every relation you have is the
yeah,
embodiment.
yeah, yeah, totally. And I mean, just like to comment on the conversation, like I thought that was that part of it because I think I felt that as it was going on too.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was wonderful because, I mean, part of why I wanted to have you talk to John is because I think your way of framing the really high level things has been super helpful for me personally, and I think would be helpful to a lot of other people as well, in disambiguating and
Mm.
clarifying a lot of the territory that starts to make the move from
Yes.
pure concepts that are disconnected from the embodiment, right? Like we've spent several thousand years just hammering at concepts, and different people at different times have been better at embodying them. But especially where we are now, it's like the problem is that no matter what your concepts are, the professor of ethics is no more ethical than someone who has no interest in ethics. So
I,
it's,
I would
and I think
suggest
that's,
that. Sorry, yeah. Go ahead. Doesn't matter.
okay.
The point. It's too
No, no, go ahead.
too tangential to make the point. Doesn't matter.
Oh, well, I was just gonna say, I mean, I think that's the thing with John. It's been so compelling. It's like he's always referencing back to, but what's happening in your real life?
Mm.
Like what's really happening in your life, and how is that? How is whatever thing you're doing, um, and whatever mapping you have, like how is it changing you? How is it making your relationships better? How is it
Hmm.
uh, all those kinds of things? I think, fundamentally, this has been my issue with Christianity that I was brought up with, was that it was all it was all about something that happens over the horizon, and this life was purely instrumental.
Mm.
And so, as long as your conceptual framing was correct and um, your belief structure was correct, you were supposedly doing well, right? And there was talk of things like sanctification, and you should be living correctly because it was Anabaptist, right? Since the Anabaptists are all about literally embodying biblical frames, but it gets
Mm.
very messy and confusing when you know biblical frames are all over the place. And so, I guess all that to say was like, and that's why I was doing that in that conversation with John, and that's what I've been trying to do in a lot of my conversations um, recently and moving forward, is because like I have quickly come to understand that as much as I enjoy and have some affinity and maybe some ability to do high level conceptual mapping and distinguishing and pulling apart and together concepts in ways that are helpful and make sense. Um, there's lots of people that are good at that, and many that I know of and observe that are better than I am. And if I can, if but but I want to become real. Like I want
Mm.
my real life every moment to be able to, you know, to have a maybe less choppy churning, to use your
Yeah.
term.
Yeah, and I think that's ultimately being with God. I mean, that is the alignment of the truest signals. I think it's a way of viewing that. Um, and I wanted to really dive into that, really dive into, what is the terribleness of churn? Well, what
Mm,
are the flames of hell that as we're processing our unconscious, or realizing that we are not in the alignment that we have set out to be on, those moments when you order the drink at the restaurant that you don't want, those things, how are those things falling out of us? And in relation to this concept of being around and within ourselves, how can we best marry those? Because I love the conversation with John. I think it was great because, in a sense, we were a brain, the three of us, in certain ways. Um, but I think that here we have an opportunity to reintegrate it in a more holistic way, where um, you're helping me with the thing that's hardest for me, and I'm doing vice versa. But then we're
mm.
doing it, on every level within ourselves. I think that's just reciprocally form off the conversation is a cool way to think of it.
Yeah, no, I like that. I like that. So I'm reading Spinoza now.
Mm.
Um, Spinoza's Religion, which is a book by Claire Carlisle. Have you read that one?
I haven't read that, but I've heard a lot about Spinoza through Rebecca Goldstein and Antonio Damasio mostly.
Okay, okay. Um, I might send you this book. It's so good. It's so good. Um, and then now I'm doing, like, as part of my morning kind of rituals, I'm doing Lectio Divina with the Ethics, which is Spinoza's
Okay.
work, right? And it's I feel like the thing that I'm starting to really see and feel that is so important is around the issue of the will, right? And the volition that is maybe the aspect of me that is in. and not around as much.
Hmm.
So if I understand you and take it to be that the aroundness is the aspect of me that is just observing my life, right? It's the aspect of me that has been given this story of Ken Lowry, right? But then the in and through is the version of me that is, you know, sitting here in a chair and mind wandering and coming back and wandering and coming back and all this stuff, right? And it seems that it's like when those two get disconnected, the one that is within starts to have maybe have a propensity to begin acting out patterns that are not actually in accordance with the, say, higher order reasoned desires and goals that I actually have for myself.
Hmm.
Now, there's all kinds of questions, say, like whether you have the right goals articulated for yourself in your mind and all those kinds of things. But once that has kind of fallen into place, which I'm not claiming to have that perfectly, but I feel like I'm no longer in what Spinoza would call like heteronomy, which is, you know, the taking on of exterior ethics from culture or a belief system or that kind of thing. I'm kind of onto that. I believe so. I mean, like who knows? But like when if I understand correctly, the way he models it is that I'm more in that second stage where I'm wanting to be in the autonomous zone, which is something like the desires and goals that I have for myself or expect for myself is really the right, maybe is how it often feels. It's an expectation of myself that then that they are according to the nature of what my journey is to be and who I am. Right? It's a sense of feeling into, you know, and like, yes, this is right, but this is not right. This is and it that might be triangulated off of all kinds of other sources, right? I use the Bible, there's all kinds of other wisdom kind of sources, but it's not dependent on those. It's autonomous. So I feel quite good about what the framework that I aspire to. Okay, so that's that piece. And then the other piece is, okay, so there's this outside and there's this inside. And it's as if when the disconnection happens, there's a way in which the will becomes disconnected maybe from the bigger picture. And then I start to act out patterns that aren't exactly, they're not in accordance with that higher order aspiration. So there's maybe a loss of the imaginal space. I'm just like spitballing here a little bit.
No, no, I'm grabbing a lot of this. Um, Very interesting. So I think, oh, go ahead if you got
Just
something.
one final, but so like for me, there's this thing it's coming down to this aspect of the will and trying to understand that. And Spinoza has been so helpful because Spinoza, you know, straightforwardly rejects the notion of free will,
Hmm.
and not that he doesn't think we have volition, but he doesn't. He would say that it's nonsense to think of it as free will. I find that argument to be quite convincing because, you know, if I try to find the point at which I'm actually autonomous in a way that's disconnected from any pull or push within my own self, you can't find it. So yeah, okay, I'll stop there.
Awesome. Yeah, so I think that being around space is kind of being the witness, and being within is coming back into the world, and you know, now you have the map. Now you know where you want to go. Your imaginal, as John would say, is oriented correctly, at least close enough that it's going to get you progress. And now you're trying to come into the world, and this is interesting. So we're back here now, and we've got the map for where we want to go in terms of the action we take. Then we crash into an experience or an event in our life, and we lose track of how to get there. We no longer recognize the map because the territory is different than we expect. And the territory being us in our own mind in this sense. And so I think when you were talking, I was really feeling it spatially in terms of like there's a closing, right? It's a you've got the North Star that you're looking towards, and something happens where your integration inverts in a way that you start to look away from it. And in those moments, it's almost like the shroud of sin blocking out the sun, something like that. And then that lostness, that I think is something like being on the dark side of the moon in the churn, right? Like you're flipping over from where the sun's hitting the moon, going to the dark side, being lost, and then coming around again. And that, death and resurrection is obviously going to play off that as well.
Yeah. Yeah, no, thank you. That's I think that's a good way of saying it. Right. And it's funny, because it's like oftentimes it's not as if there's things that I'm acting out that I wouldn't want anyone to know about, or, like that kind of thing. That's not really what seems to be the issue. What seems to be the issue is it's like you said, it's as if I get distracted, pulled into something. It's a pulling feeling. It's a it's like you use the term crash into an experience, and that can certainly happen. You crash into an experience, but I find that oftentimes it's less of a crashing into an experience for me, and more of a like, getting pulled sideways or downward.
Yes. And if you think of again the through line of the sphere, if you pull, imagine you have a million strings tied to a balloon, and you pull it and the whole balloon comes instead of one string, right? So you're kind of collapsing a space down into a point. And that's what integration is. Like you have all your different data points, it's your shape. Well, how did they get there? Because of the push. But when you're collapsing, the pull down to the single frame that you are. And so it makes sense that it's a pull. I want to talk about where it's pulling from and to, perhaps, but it really makes sense that it's a pull because it's not, it kind of couldn't be any other motion because of how radial it would be in the fact that it has to be able to interface with all aspects of your experience. So you're kind of pulling with many ropes, everything together to form a self, to form your perspective. So if your frame, your identity is essentially all the things you've pulled together into the shape you are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So what is pulling when you're flowing, and what's pulling when you're churning? And I think obviously part of the answer here will be in the tonos, the pulling and the relaxing of the pulling is the flow. Getting that right is the flow, and getting it wrong is the churn. Although you have to, like, you actually have to churn. You can't flow your way through churn. I don't know how to say that better right now, but yeah. You actually kind of can, but there's
Yeah.
reasons not to do it, and it's not, anyway.
So I guess I'm envisioning, right, like a point with a million strings attached to, say, all the um, images of the let's to use Johnson language. I think John would be okay with would be like the multiplicity of selves,
Yeah.
right? There's the or multiplicity of me's. Maybe that's better, right?
Yes. Yeah.
All the various me's. And one of the things that I'm finding is that no, no, let me finish my visualization first. It's like if I'm here in the middle, and there's all these me's around, holding them all in a
Mm.
sense, where they're all holding, there's a through line of them all that is what internally I perceive as me,
Mm.
which is usually a function of some kind of triangulation of what I actually experience and what I observe other people to feed back toward me
Mm.
in interactions.
Because the other that you're seen as is one of you. That,
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so all those amalgamations, when there's an experience or I act in a way, or when I watch myself act in a way that causes significant discord between models of me's, that seems to be the problem,
Mm.
right? It's like
Yes.
when I because oftentimes it's things like the way I'll behave in conversations. I'll be dismissive of someone when I in fact want to be compassionate and open. Or
Mm.
I'll okay, here's an example. I'm at work the other day, and I wear a rosary. I wear a rosary on my neck. I was wearing scrubs, and so it was fairly visible. And another provider who I don't didn't know very well came by, and she stopped and said, "Oh, is that a rosary?" I said, "Oh yeah, yeah, yeah." She said, "Are you Catholic?" Or maybe I asked if she wasn't. She said yes, and she said, "Are you Catholic?" And instead of what I would have preferred to do, which would have been to say, well, kind of, and then opened up to her to invite her into a conversation. I launched into some kind of explanation about how like kind of Catholic, but also kind of not because I'm blah blah blah. Blah. And like I'm watching myself talking. Can what are you doing? Right? And then and then afterwards I have this discordance of models, right? Um, between the aspirational self that I wish to become and who I've who I've observed this version of me to be, and and that seems to be where the kind of problem happens.
Yeah. There's some very powerful stuff there. So I'm going to go back for a moment to the model we were building with John, because I think we're adding a dimensionality to it right now. It's very, very powerful. Um, so I was talking about kind of the shape and the shape shifting that you are, which is a great tagline with John.
Yeah,
So the shape that you are and the operations that you'll take, that's what's pulling you. So you're a shape and you're being pulled. You were talking about this in terms of like stretching time. It's sort of
mm,
the dimensional torsion of one shape to the next. I like to think about it in terms of caramel because caramel is a substance that can be quite hard and soft and can kind of have these in between states. You can even imagine kind of spinning it into a like lamellar, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that, flow, like when water looks like a solid thing.
yeah, yeah.
Um, and so what I think you're talking about is that the pulling comes from many directions, always, the different me's. So in this case, you have the shapes that you are across different moments of time and the operations, but there's actually a stacked series of operations, and we're being pulled to them with different intensities. So you might imagine yourself mentally being drawn and quartered by your different selves, and they're all pulling in each moment with different strengths.
Mm,
So, if I'm one version of me shows up when I'm nervous or I'm trying to prevent one thing, it's got the answer. It says, I know just the things to invert to make it so that that's not hard for you. Because you're really trying to integrate information always. And yourselves are sort of efficiency arguments to your mind in a sense, saying, I can interpret reality with the least effort for you or the most rightness. And you have to choose, are you committed to doing the hard right thing or the easy? That's kind of the thing of the ego. The ego, I think, at its peak, is giving you the easiest answer. the integration that takes the least self change. That's the ego's through line.
Oh, sure, sure, yeah.
And if you
Oh,
invert
interesting.
that,
Okay.
the integration that takes the most personal change,
Yeah,
which, and so if you think of this in terms of flow and churn again, the
yeah,
ego is saying, don't even just ignore the churn, we'll keep flowing. That's pretty much
yeah,
what the ego is saying.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And then your higher self, which is saying, no, no, go through the churn because real flow is only found that way.
Yeah.
And to bring that back to the halo, it's like the map or the um, conceptual grasping of going around is sort of like your the size of your consciousness, how broadly and what volume can you um, cohere and integrate fluidly. And then your embodiment, I think, is the brightness. That's the sun that's hitting other people and actually going to have that warming effect on them.
Hmm.
Um, and they're connected, right? So as it gets brighter, it gets bigger, and as it gets bigger, it at least has the potential to get brighter. But when they
Yeah, yeah,
fight each other, it's the total opposite. So it's literally a growing and shrinking of the divine space, the halo in that sense.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, there's a bunch of things there. One of them that I want to talk about is how you use the language drawn and quartered, because like that hits very phenomenologically real for me because I find that oftentimes what I experience in the aftermath of watching myself act in a way that is not in accordance with who I aspire to become, I begin drawing and quartering myself
Mm,
over the the lack of proper reflection of the aspirational self in the existential self. And it's interesting because
mm,
I'm very very much cognitively aware and have thought through and paid attention to and understand the arguments for the and have experienced the way in which when I'm looking from the perspective of the aspirational self towards the existential self, there is nothing but, let's say, forgiveness and agape, right? When looking from the point of the aspirational self toward my existential self,
mm.
the attitude is always forgiveness and
And you might imagine that as a rising and brightening, expanding,
mhm.
yeah, love.
Yeah. And so there's a way in which, like, I'm necessarily acting from the space of my like existential self, almost like torturing and, let's say, creating hell for myself
Mm,
based on a comparison to a version of myself that could be, because I am not that already, or because I have missed the mark. And part of the reason that I bring that up and talk about it that way is because I've been thinking a lot for a while about forgiveness and how much forgiveness from a Christian perspective, and mostly in the teachings of Jesus, is forgiveness of how much you are forgiven is directly tied to how you forgive others. Like they're the parallel is so clear that they're almost necessarily tied together always.
and again, yeah,
And
because others are another you in your mind, even if you're not consciously aware of that.
yeah, and then but even when you've forgiven others, who are obviously others, you have to forgive the other versions of yourself than where you are right now. Something like that.
The ones who did not. You have to forgive the versions of yourself that did not forgive the others, in a sense. Like,
Uh, uh,
because I think you're pointing to that layer between, I forget how John said it, but it was like, it's this Tai Chi stance thing. It was like the meta optimal grip, but then there's like a meta optimal gripping of the meta optimal grip. And there can be conflict between those two layers
yeah, yeah,
because one is the around and the other one is within. And actually, this is why I said that meditation actually helped me collapse, because I think that you can get to certain points in your development on one or the other of these that you actually will increase the amount of conflict you feel internally from what you were feeling before. Because before you were just flowing through, ignoring all your churn and everything that's great. You know, you see lots of people high functioning, just not dealing with these problems.
yeah, yeah.
But as you deal with the problems more and more, you actually get to places where you realize the gap. You know, I think you're talking about sort of the gap between where you want to be and where you are. Actually, as you move into this space, gets wider because you understand it more. So as your understanding drops deeper, the destination, and it's a trajectory, it's a vector, it's not a place, but you know, it's like infinity is even higher for you now. And you
Yeah,
are,
yeah,
and if you invert that, you're lower.
yeah, yeah.
So in a sense, I want to get this back to the direction thing because I think you know, if we're empowered, if we're feeling like our aspirational, imaginal self is pulling us forward, we've got a lot of forward energy, we're going, things are good. But the opposite of that is backward energy, which is self-collapsing, shrinking, crushing down. And that's still the relationship between the imaginal and um, the rest of you.
Mhm.
So so when we're inspired and aligned and embodied, we're invigorated and charging forward. And when we're not those things, we're collapsing inward. And the gap, we're talking about the space in between what moves us forward and moves us back is
Yeah.
actually, so we have forward motion and backward motion. And then there's like another layer above it that's operating like this. And this, that's the sense of gap.
Mhm.
And this maybe how we bring the vertical in, right? Because whether you're look from here looking up, that's
Mhm.
um, you know, depending on how you view that, that could actually be it crushing down on you. Whereas if you're
Mhm.
up here looking down, so if you're your existential self looking up at your ideal self, it can feel like, wow, that is. And if we look at another person now, we can look at John that way, and anyone, it's just like there's so much above me. The gap is enormous. It feels worse that I know this person exists. That you, a lot of people do that. They look around, they see wonderful people, and it makes them feel worse about themselves because of that gap.
Yeah.
But that's actually your own framing doing that. That if
Yeah.
you invert that framing, that same person, that same thing, entity, whatever, it can be. It's so amazing that this thing exists because now I can be more like something I love, more like the essence of my love.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, that's I like that. It's interesting because it's so it I don't know, it strikes me so much as being a problem of identity,
Mm-hmm.
right? So much of it's a problem of where I'm identified
Yes.
in the world, right? Because there's a sense in which you can almost identify with any point in the world. I think this goes to some of the work that John's done with like people being able to imaginally almost inhabit the Mars rover,
Mm-hmm.
you know, with their like you can kind of like throw your consciousness into things and take that perspective and almost become that thing. Like
Yes.
as an example, I was sitting on the our back deck the other day. It was actually a nice day, and there was a mallard duck down in the swimming around in the stream down below. And I just sat there and just stared at him for probably 10 or 15 minutes and was in a pretty good space and pretty open space and was really just opened my mind to feel like what would it feel like to be stuck floating in this water swimming
Mm.
around right now. And it was incredible. I mean, it was an incredible experience because it felt as if I got to be the duck, right? And part of it was I realized that being a duck would be really cool. Like you get to
Oh yeah.
swim, you get to dive underwater, you get to fly. Like it's amazing. It's
Oh
a
yeah.
pretty good life. Um, but anyway, the point is that there's a way in which you can kind of take up the position of any particular being or thing that is a part of the world that you know. You can take the perspective of, people are doing this constantly when they're advocating for certain places of land or,
Mm,
a certain variety of owl that's in danger because they're cutting down this forest or something. I think
yes.
you, we we can talk about it as being anthropomorphizing, which is one way of doing it. It's almost like that's one direction of doing it. It's like making the duck into the human. Or I can do the other thing and make myself into the duck.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, so, which is imaginal versus imagination or fantasy kind of thing. But the point that I'm trying to make is that I can do the same thing and identify with different aspects of my experience. And what seems to be, because I'm trying to pull this down into the actual, like, where's the flip happening that we can hopefully
Mm,
start to make the churning more flowy.
yeah.
Um, uh, it's something like, where am I identifying, right? And it seems like the guilt function, like guilt is a function of the awareness of the discrepancy between the existential and the aspirational. And when that is foregrounded, maybe it's in order to foreground it, you must take the identity position of the existential self and look from there toward the aspirational self. And based on the awareness of that comparison, you get the guilt function, which creates the separation. What do you think of that proposal?
Yes, definitely. The okay, I'm gonna take what you said in different parts because you said a lot of things, and I'm gonna build them up as we go. It's not clear to me where I'm going, but I'm going somewhere. I know that. So the the you were talking about our ability to have a contextual identity, and
Mm,
you see this in the unique or nearly unique human ability to use tools. This is for me. I'm a hockey player, Canadian, pretty standard. And so when you put your hands on a stick, you change what you are. Your identity shifts completely.
yeah,
Whenever you pick up any tool, and you could do this non-physically as well, mentally, in the same way that we were talking about how John practices Tai Chi. Now he's probably an experienced enough Tai Chi and meditator to do Tai Chi and do it mentally, or just do it mentally. You can through ritual, you can embed the mental function of the ritual and do it without doing it. And visualization is another. Basketball players practicing their shot, visualizing the shot. You could practice when you're not on the court. That is a real thing. That's improving things. Um, and so I want to say one thing because it was distracting me from your point. So we might have to repeat something. But I was coming to this place of realizing, like, what I think I was saying to John was that the what we're trying to do with this whole process is make the imaginal real.
mm,
Really recognize that it is, because
hmm
it's already real. It's all pattern within us is coming from somewhere. Where is it coming from? Well, obviously it's coming from the universe. It's coming in a way that, even though now it's mental, the way that it came in, the way that that information was formed, is still physically in that data. That's information. So it
mm,
has a certain shape and a form, and you're unpacking that as you process things. But nothing in you didn't come from outside of you. I mean, you constructed of it atomically, and then obviously mentally as well.
hmm
So I think, like with ritual, the whole idea of the axes that I was talking about was basically creating a space so that you can presence it and look as it.
mm.
And so when you have to make something real, you create a space and then you occupy it, recursively, hyperbolically flow through it, and that's your presence being that information in a sense. So hockey player, whatever, these are kind of just different roles that you can embody and take on. Um, and the Okay, I'm trying to pull it all together now. So I might need you to remind me what you were saying at the end, because I just wanted to touch on what I think me and John were saying there, which is that making and John's whole worry, which he's historically informed. So if you are, it should be your worry. The imaginary being real is incredibly dangerous, and the imaginal making that real is not dangerous because it actually is real, because that reciprocal forming, um, something like that motion space in your mind we were talking about is something like the memory of your prior perception, or something like that, just in non-language terms, your ability to do math effectively. Because that's what this is. That all these like weird things that I couldn't tell you that my body knows how to do that. I can tap into that mentally and never understand the formula, but I'm still doing it relationally.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's the
Yeah.
context.
And I think that distinction of being so careful about using the imaginal, but um, not not going into um, the imagination. And I like to use the word fantasy just because it just keeps them more
Yeah.
distinct in my head.
Yeah.
That's just a personal thing. But yeah, it is so dangerous because as soon as it becomes a projection, you're no longer in the flow. You're fundamentally disconnected, and it's a totally different thing. But I guess, yeah, the final thing that I was saying was the the point at which the disconnection happens that allows for the churn to take over and disallow for flow is this identification with the existential self. And I guess I'm asking, the question is happening in my head is what causes that identification? And it's something like, that tension between the various me's, I think. And then it's like you identify with the existential self, recognize the difference between the existential and the aspirational, and that awareness is guilt. And then guilt is the thing that makes, like, guilt is like the churn. It's the fire, if you will. At least for me, it's the guilt and shame are the things where it's grates on.
Yeah. That's really powerful. The way I was imagining that as you were talking through it was you gave each processor a rotation direction, so you can rotate clockwise or counterclockwise. Well, if you have at least two that are operating in function right now, one's going clockwise, the other one's going clockwise, that's flow. But when one's going clockwise, this one's going counterclockwise, that's churn. And that gets to the through line gestalt conversation we were having at the end there. And obviously it's a little more complex because there's three, but
Yeah.
and there's probably there is ways of spinning horizontally and vertically too, but way too complicated for right now.
Yeah, there's way more dimensions than just one or two, but
it's always useful to drop down to one dimension and then build them out, because that's don't make the hard things complicated.
yes,
Make them simple and then they get easier and reciprocally.
yes.
So if you imagine them like the rotations happening in different directions, that's churn. And you have these three places that you can stand. Of course, you can stand on every surface. Just trying to simplify it right now. And look each way from each thing. Doesn't matter. You have three places that you can stand, and you stand and you face maybe, and the way you face is the rotation. So yeah, what's ultimately happening is that there's so many different dimensions, but just to isolate it down to one, thoughts, feelings, they're clashing because where you're occupying the three processors, if you want to stay in that place, you have to ignore information.
Mm-hmm.
Your current stance, if you want to maintain your current stance, you have to ignore information. And if
Mm-hmm.
that's the case, then you're kind of like planting and getting hit by the ocean. You're not moving.
Mm-hmm.
But if you have, John's Tai Chi sense of because it's all about how you're hitting the dance pads, left,
Yeah.
right, back, forward, left, right, back, how you're doing that. And you can stand firm and experience either maximal churn or maximal flow without, integrating properly. So when you're integrating fully, everything inverts from when you're not, right? So that's why it's hard to talk about. But if you imagine your stances, which processor you're standing on, that's your presencing. Which one you're in, looking at the other one. So which one you're looking as, and which one you're looking at. This is how you start to kind of think of what's going on there. But you asked a specific question that's one layer beneath that. I just wanted to put that on the table so we could get to that lower layer, which is what is happening when you're identifying. So when you're presencing, what is that? And how can we presence in multiple things to various degrees? And how can we understand that process so that how can we simplify that process so it's easier? And how can we take on that process so that we can understand it? I think you said it beautifully in the conversation with John, where correct me if I get this wrong, but I think you said you need the world to show itself to you so that you can show yourself to the world. Maybe you could kind of rephrase that for me.
Oh yeah. First, just a comment on what you were saying. I liked the this notion of the lack of integration based on the hold of a particular perspective, because it almost makes me like it provides me with an interesting perspective to relate to myself when I'm in the state of, as I said before, guilt, where maybe it's actually not, in fact, maybe the notion that the guilt comes from the distance between the aspirational and the existential is in fact an illusion, for the fact that the actual experience of disharmony or discordance that is experienced is not, that's the illusion that it wants you to buy, right? To use mythical language, this is the illusion that Satan puts in front of you.
Mm.
Whereas the real thing that's causing you pain is the fact that you're no longer updating, no longer integrating cleanly, because you've actually identified with a particular version of yourself.
Yes.
And thus to speak in the manner that I did, as you referred to in the conversation with John, I am no longer accepting the world, or I'm no longer in acquiescence to the state of being of the world, to use this kind of a Spinoza type term. And therefore, I am no longer the shape shifting space, because I'm holding a shape. And instead of allowing the world to disclose itself properly to me, and then updating myself to adaptively fit the new shape available to me, I'm holding a shape, but it's not actually the difference between what I could be and what I am. It's simply the difference between, it's simply the fact that I'm not inhabiting the space that is available.
Yes. That feels really powerful for me there. I think you're bringing in time now, which is
Mm-hmm.
appropriate, of course. So the cycle rate, the tick rate, the flow is a speed ultimately, and there's a certain speed. Now I'm imagining we're cross country skiing in our mind in a sense. You know, this is dancing with your mind. That's what we're talking about. It's very,
Yeah.
very literally, actually, I believe uses the same functionality as dancing with your body. So it's super literally dancing. Um, and the churn may just be not spinning fast enough to get to fluidity. You know,
Mm,
like if you're in a boat and you're driving on the water, the chop, you know, there's certain speeds at which you'll cut through the water and other speeds at which you'll crash on the waves.
yeah.
And so I think what we're talking about here is that, you know, if you're powering something up, you're spinning it really fast and you know, the consciousness is getting bigger and brighter.
Yeah.
And then if you're spinning it really slow, it's getting smaller and shrinking. Um, you might even think of your consciousness as the amount of information you're integrating in a moment.
Mhm.
Um, and that's why you want to broaden your awareness so that you can integrate more, make it brighter. And then also the brightness is the speed. I mean, they're all interrelated, but thinking of the brightness as a speed is a really useful heuristic for that mental fluidity. And yeah, because okay, because it's not presencing isn't easy to explain because it's space and time. Um, and time isn't a space. You can't point to it. It's a direction. It's a rate. And so ultimately we're trying to tie together infinity and unity.
Mhm.
And there's something about the way you toggle that rate. That's why I was saying cross country skiing, because it's like you want to go power strides. I don't know much about cross country skiing. This might be wrong, but you want to go power strides and then coast, you know, power stride, coast, that kind of idea. Because if you don't do the coasting, you're not getting a frictionless slide. So if you're trying to run on ground, the mind is more fluid than ground. So if you're trying to run on it, you actually need to adopt this sliding of floating on the momentum and
Mhm.
then pushing when it's the right moment. And I think anyway, just trying to build in that time concept for us a bit.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, I want to pick up with time, but I need to pause for a second because I have a phone call that I have to make. Is that okay?
Yeah, totally fine.
Okay. Hey, can we pause the recording?
Yeah, I can. All
Sorry
right.
about that. When it rains, it's poured. Um, so I wanted to pick up on the time component because I was watching a video this morning or listening to um, between John Vervaeke and Johannes Niederhauser. I don't know if you know him at all.
Not familiar.
He's he's had quite a few conversations with John. I think they're good friends. And Johannes is he works as kind of a almost like a freelance professor on of philosophy on Heidegger. He wrote a thesis on Heidegger's, I think particularly about death, and but he's kind of a Heideggerian philosopher. So they having a conversation about being, and I think it's called falling in love with being again. It's an excellent conversation, very very good. But in the conversation, they talk about time and apparently Heidegger's. I haven't read Heidegger yet, although I think now I need to. Um, but these three notions of thrownness, being thrownness, projection, and concern. And those are correlated with the past, the future, and the present. So we're thrown in and 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 then we project a future and then we're concerned about the now. And so kind of I think it's trying to pull those into kind of phenomenology. Um, but I like that, like those three words are kind of helping me to put maybe another layer on the dimensionality of kind of the recursion, and specifically the difficulty with allowing for free flow integration as opposed to pulling forward static versions of the self.
Mm.
And I think maybe when I use the self in that way, I'm referring to the amalgamation of the me's. So I'll just put that there.
Yeah, I think that's really good. Pulling forward. So if you're pulling backwards, that's the easier one to visualize, then you're causing the processor you're looking at to spin counterclockwise towards you.
Mm.
So if you're trying to take what you want to be and pull it as it is, with like just like pull it through all the resistance of the change you'd have to go through and not do that change, then that is like that's like crashing churn into yourself, because you're reaching for something, you say I want that, and everything else get out of, I don't care, like you're basically um causing crashing waves into your face of churn as you're trying to do that. And then if you're in the opposite, if you're the and that's why that's not love. That's the opposite of love, is trying to possess something. So try and take it and pull it towards yourself. Versus if you're the aspirational self looking at the existential self, then you're pulling it towards you through letting it come to you.
Mm.
It's a you're using your presence as a north star. You're guiding rather than pulling. It's a completely different thing when you flip orientations there, rather than see like making static, holding, seizing, pulling, versus sort of this way, like guiding, like
Yeah.
everything's loose one way and everything's rigid the other way.
Yeah. And something that came up for me when you were saying that was that there's a way that when you're operating from, let's say, the guilt framework and the existential self, you're almost trying to force your aspirational self onto where you are,
Mm-hmm.
versus when you're, because it's not as if you really say become your aspirational self in order to look from it in the same way. It's not actualized in the same way that your existential self is, but you can look from that place, but it allows the shape shifting to take place in the dynamic sense, as opposed to trying to force the idyllic shape into the next moment. Something like that.
Yes.
I'm
So
just trying
I'm
to throw different frames on them.
no, that's great, because I think you're right that that ideal self, that root awareness, is really the logos, right? And so it's the form within which everything else is forming. Um, and so you might think of what happens when things hit the edge of, which is your frame, when things hit the edge and realize that really they should go out. You should reintegrate if you want to bring this information in. Um, your response to that can be a contracting, like a resisting the force that's coming out, which is going to cause everything in there to reverberate differently, or an expanding of the self. Basically, if you're doing your Sudoku puzzle and one of the numbers ends up outside of the box, you've got to make your canvas larger, and that kind of like, if your frame we're thinking of as your own logos right now, obviously there's the ultimate logos behind that, but that's where the tension is really, rebounding off the side of yourself and how you treat those rebounds.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that's very helpful. I mean, like, again, like I said, like this stage of my journey seems to be so much about it's not even the temptation, and especially early on, it was this drive to say, get to a place, right?
Mm,
Where where this happened automatically, right?
yeah.
Which is, would be part of my perception of what enlightenment would look like. But of
Hmm.
course, but now I'm letting go of that because I don't think that it's a place you get to. And instead, what I'm trying to do is hone the ability, or maybe better, train the muscle of being gracious and forgiving to um in those moments, to those versions of me,
Hmm.
such that it takes, I mean, what such that I suffer less, right? Such that there's, yeah. And this has been really helpful, I think.
Yeah. Let's see if we can get back into the personal now, because I did it again. I went conceptual on this. But take flow, churn, and rate, because I think that was super useful. Obviously, the synchronization of flow, churn, and rate is what we're talking about. But let's dive into maybe an example of like you're in a situation and you don't want to be. You'd rather be somewhere else, or do you want to start there, or do you want to start at the fork of the road where you're deciding? I think there's two places. There's like right before you take a form and right after you've taken a form. Obviously,
Mm.
as you're taking the forms.
Start before and go through it.
So I think, yeah, it's basically you're looking at a situation, a fork in the road, and you're saying, do I want to do I have the energy to do this? Can I do this? Because ultimately, shame, contraction, that's I can't. That's what that I can't. I just can't. I give up. I'm done. That's one option. So you have a you have always a two-layered option. You have what you're actually going to do and what you're going to tell yourself. And that's because what you're actually going to do is going to go forward into your mental structure, and what you tell yourself is going to go backward.
Mm-hmm.
And you can misalign those, and that's what the ego does all the time. That's an inversion, right? Where you're like, I'm going to continue being the best person ever. That's like classic ego. And then your mind is like, perfect. You seamlessly crossed this moment. There was no nervousness, no emotions, because you didn't engage with the moment at all, but that just hidden. And like you're having a great time, not knowing that you're not doing, holding yourself in right alignment.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So as you're approaching something, it's always two choices. It's what am I going to do, and what am I going to tell myself that I'm doing. And those lining those up is flow, and those being separated is churn. Because when you do something, that's not quite right actually, because of the what we were talking about before. But when you do something, when you're looking at those two options and then you choose a path,
Yeah.
there's another choice to be made about how you tell you the story you tell yourself about what you've done.
Right, right,
And that's the hyperbolic honesty that we're trying to tease out.
right. Yeah, yeah. Because okay, so let's move forward a step. So you've made a choice that is not what you wish you had made,
Yeah.
and now you're dealing with the narrative really,
Hmm.
which is, oh, how am I going to integrate this?
Yes, and I think emphasizing that, like, how am I going to integrate this? Because when we feel like we can't integrate something, the problem's too big. The amount of change is too intense, or we'd be too disoriented. You might think of the larger the changes, the larger the moon is, and so you'd spend longer on the dark side of the moon before you came back around, in that sense, where it's just like there's a sense of understanding This is so integrate. It's so interesting because we're obviously already integrating it
Mhm.
for this to be possible. So because you're basically saying we know what the scale of the problem is before we deal with it because we can feel that in the intensity of our emotions,
Sure,
and
sure.
that's what we run away from or not. So on some level, it's the integration's happening, and are you going to be that integration, or are you going to be something separate from it? Um,
Create an artificial layer.
yeah, yeah, an abstraction.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So is your are you going to allow yourself to become imaginary, or are you going to process this and keep your imaginal real? I think that's the
Mm.
stakes in any
Oh,
moment.
interesting.
Are you going to allow your imaginal to separate from your imaginary to separate from your imaginal?
Mm. Oh, that's an interesting way to say it.
Because if the world is how you imagine it to be, that's perfect resonance.
Mhm.
And you have to go through the imaginal to do that. But I think that's always that is the tonos in the sense of like, you have to separate to deconstruct and reintegrate. But are you going to which side of that equation are you going to fall on as you go through that choice?
Interesting. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah. And it's the distance between, it's the delta,
mm,
right? Because you don't actually exist as either one. You don't actually exist as the real integrated update or the space of the narrative of the abstraction. Although I frequently convince myself that I do.
and we operate as that, even
Yeah, yeah,
though we are always the possibility space that
right.
contains those options to available
Yeah,
to it. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Okay. I think I need to wrap up,
Okay. Yeah.
but this has been wonderful,
Yeah.
as always.
Sounds great. Great to chat with you, Ken. We'll
Thank you, Steve.
dive in again soon for sure.
Yeah.